They lived there for 2,000 years, from the Roman ruins of Volubilis to the crowded Medinas of Fez, lighting candles, teaching Torah, speaking Judeo-Arabic in a land that never truly called them its own. But when scientists finally looked inside their blood, what they found shattered every assumption about belonging. Moroccan Jews do not genetically resemble their neighbors, not the Berbers, whose mountains they walked, not the Arabs, whose language they spoke, not even the Maghribis, whose land became their home. Instead, their DNA points somewhere else entirely, to the stone villages of Cyprus, to the hills of the Druze in Lebanon, to the ancient Levant, where empires rose and prophets once walked. This isn't a metaphor. It's measurable. Studies show Moroccan Jews carry around 40 to 42% Middle Eastern ancestry, with another 37 to 39% from Southern Europe, likely from the Sephardic influx after the 1492 expulsions from Spain, and just 20 to 21% North African, a sliver, sometimes even less. Their maternal lineages, they lack the signature Berber mtDNA haplogroups, M1 and U6, almost entirely. In other words, for 2 millennia, their daughters did not marry local women. Their sons did not blend into the host population. Geneticists call this Indogamy. But for Moroccan Jews, it was more than marriage law. It was survival. And the real mystery? Even after 2,000 years in North Africa, the Moroccan Jewish genome still clusters tightly with Ashkenazi Jews, Iranian Jews, and Sephardim, not with Arabs or North African Muslims. Think about that. They lived side by side, ate similar food, spoke dialects of the same tongue, but in their bones, they stayed apart. Their genes remembered something ancient, a signal not erased by exile, not diluted by time. If you're fascinated by lost histories and ancient DNA mysteries, subscribe now, because this story is just beginning. And the next clue, it's buried beneath a Roman ruin, where menorahs and Latin inscriptions share the same stone. Whispers from a time when Jewish blood first touched Moroccan soil. Volubilis, 3rd century CE, a Roman city on the edge of empire, olive groves stretching toward the mountains, temples rising in Latin order. But deep beneath the dust, something else entirely. A Jewish synagogue. Not imagined, not folklore, proven. Archaeologists uncovered menorah-decorated oil lamps, Hebrew tombstones, and a synagogue inscription dated to the 200 CE. One epitaph names a woman, Matrona, daughter of Rabbi Yehuda, her name carved in Hebrew, her story forgotten by history, remembered only by stone. These were not recent arrivals. Historical consensus suggests Jews may have settled in North Africa as early as the 1st century CE, following the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. Some may have come even earlier, as Phoenician merchants or Hellenized Judeans during the Punic Wars. But in Volubilis, they were no longer exiles. They were locals. They were Tashavim, a word meaning residents, but carrying far more weight than that. For centuries, they lived under Roman law, often protected by imperial decrees, taxed as a community, but allowed their own courts, dietary laws, and Sabbath observance. This wasn't tolerance, it was structure, legal recognition of difference, and for a time it worked. Even as empires fell and rose, the Jewish presence endured, adapting through late antiquity, weathering the arrival of Islam by the 7th century, integrating into a dhimmi status under early Muslim dynasties. But by the 12th century, that fragile coexistence collapsed. Under the brutal rule of the Almohad Caliphate, 1146 to 1248 CE, Morocco turned against its religious minorities. The Almohads demanded forced conversions. Synagogues were destroyed, rituals banned, Torahs burned. Entire communities disappeared. Those who stayed vanished into silence. Crypto-Jews, hiding mezuzot behind wall tiles, whispering Kaddish in cellars. But not all disappeared. Some escaped, northward, eastward, or quietly survived, passing memory through breath, not text. And just as Morocco turned inward, across the sea, another trauma was beginning. In 1492, under Ferdinand and Isabella's Alhambra decree, Spain unleashed a wave of violent expulsions that would send an entire people into exile again. And where did tens of thousands flee? To the very coast, where their ancestors once built synagogues under Rome, into the arms of a shattered community, waiting to become something new. But these weren't peaceful settlers, they were genetic refugees. And they brought secrets. Summer 1492. Spain, burning under the fires of a new Catholic monarchy. Ferdinand and Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. All Jews must convert or leave. Over 100,000 people pack what they can, scrolls, heirlooms, memories, and sail into exile. They scatter across the Mediterranean, hunted by pirates, rejected at ports. But one land opens its gates. Morocco. Here, the Sephardim arrived not as guests, but as waves, reshaping everything. They brought their dialects, Ladino, Haketia, music that danced between Castilian and Hebrew. They brought Andalusian court melodies, the legal codes of Maimonides, Iberian rituals that had survived centuries of convivencia and Catholic suspicion. But they also brought something no one could see, a shift in the genome. Because buried in the maternal line of these refugees was a marker, mitochondrial haplogroup HV0, one of the most telling genetic signatures of Iberian Jewish women. Unlike the ancient Tashavim, who avoided mixing with locals, these new arrivals had already absorbed traces of European ancestry. Their DNA carried centuries of quiet admixture with Spanish converts, with crypto-Jews, with Iberian mothers whose bloodlines now flowed into North Africa. Genetic studies confirm the spike. European maternal lineages surged in Moroccan Jews after 1492. Not Berber, not Maghrebi, European. And the science tells us more. This admixture was female-driven. The male line stayed Levantine, mostly unchanged. But the women brought the storm. And it wasn't always welcomed. The older Moroccan Jews, the Tashavim, suddenly found themselves the minority in their own homeland. Their dialects, their customs, even their burial rites were overtaken. The newcomers, called Megarashim, the expelled, soon dominated communal life. This wasn't a blending. It was a takeover. Cultural, religious, genetic. And while the Torah remained the same, the people holding it had changed. But this fusion wasn't random. It had rules, borders, walls. Because what came next was not freedom. It was containment. A new era of survival, hidden behind the laws of blood. And in that blood, buried in the maternal line, was a chilling genetic echo. 27%. According to mitochondrial DNA studies by Behar et al., 2008, 27% of Moroccan Jews descend from a single female ancestor. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a real woman. Somewhere in time, her lineage became a genetic bottleneck, passed silently through generations. It's what geneticists call a founder effect. And this one wasn't mild. It was catastrophic. The likely trigger? Trauma. The anti-Jewish massacres of 1391 in Seville, Valencia, and beyond, where entire Sephardic families were butchered in the streets. Or the 1492 Alhambra Decree, where Jews were expelled overnight, hunted by inquisitors, stripped of land, dignity, and in many cases, lineage. What followed wasn't integration. It was defense. A sealed-off community. Because when a population loses mothers, it doesn't just lose bodies. It loses memory, legacy, inheritance. And so Moroccan Jewry built walls. Not of stone, but of custom. Intermarriage with outsiders became rare, sometimes forbidden. Rituals tightened. Families looked inward for safety. What emerged was genetic endogamy, so strong that mitochondrial diversity nearly froze, as seen in multiple population genetic studies. Campbell et al. 2012, Oster et al. 2012. Every marriage became more than tradition, it became resistance. Because survival wasn't just physical anymore. It was genealogical. But this protection had a dark undercurrent, a narrowing of choice, of freedom, of love. When every union is weighed by bloodline, not heart, what gets preserved and what gets sacrificed? And here's the twist. That maternal line, that perfect, uninterrupted signal, wasn't mirrored by the men. The Y chromosomes told a far messier story. Because while the daughters carried one lineage, the fathers brought many. Some from Jerusalem, some from Spain, but a few from a place no one expected. Phoenicia, Tyre, Sidon. Traders, scribes, migrants. Their signatures appear like ghost prints in the Moroccan Jewish genome. And one rare Y chromosome, Q, YP1236, opens the next door to a migration older than Rome, a connection deeper than exile, and a mystery carved not in Torah, but in trade routes. And it didn't come from Morocco. When scientists analyzed the Y chromosomes of Moroccan Jewish men, they expected a mix, Berber, Arab, Levantine, maybe even Iberian traces. What they found instead was isolation, precision, defiance. The dominant markers were J1 and J2, lineages anchored in the ancient Near East. Not North Africa, not Spain. These haplogroups cluster tightly with Palestinians, Bedouins, Druze, and Lebanese Christians, populations with shared Levantine ancestry, unchanged for thousands of years. This wasn't some distant genetic coincidence. This was continuity, from the Kingdom of Judah to Casablanca. And then came the silence. EM81, the Berber marker, found in up to 80% of Amazigh men, is nearly absent in Moroccan Jews, virtually erased. Despite living side by side with Berber tribes for centuries, the Jewish male lineage never absorbed their DNA. This is more than genetics. It's social architecture. Across the Almohad persecutions, the Spanish refugee waves, and the Ottoman era, Jewish men passed down identity through strict endogamy. Religious law prohibited marriage outside the faith, and over centuries, that law hardened into a wall, one that even the empire couldn't breach. But deep in the genome, a whisper survived. Haplogroup Q, YP1236. Rare, unmistakable, traced to Phoenician and Mesopotamian networks, from Tyre, Sidon, perhaps even further east. It appears in Jewish men from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Spain, hinting at an ancient class of migrant scholars and sea traders moving between ports, spreading Torah and trade routes in tandem. They were not natives. They were navigators. And while the women preserved community, the fathers preserved contact. But DNA remembers more than geography. It remembers the rupture, because the next fracture wasn't about genes. It was about belonging. And it happened not in Babylon, not in Spain, but in Casablanca. Between 1948 and 1967, nearly 274,000 Moroccan Jews left the only home they had known for centuries. Some boarded ships to France, others vanished onto military aircraft bound for Israel, and some left without saying goodbye. It wasn't a traditional exile. It was layered, complex, a second displacement inside the first. For over 500 years, these Jews had rebuilt themselves after the fall of Al-Andalus. They had merged Iberian liturgy with North African soil. They had created new languages, Haketia, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Amazigh. Their kitchens smelled of cumin and cinnamon. Their synagogues echoed Andalusian melodies. But then, Morocco changed. After independence in 1956, a new national identity emerged. Arab, Muslim, exclusivist. By the early 1960s, Hebrew was banned in schools. Jewish leaders were monitored. Zionist affiliation was criminalized. And after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, fear turned to silence. And so they left. Not in chains, but in fragments. Operation Yakin, 1961 to 1964, secretly evacuated over 97,000 Moroccan Jews to Israel with French and Mossad coordination. Operation Kadima followed. But these missions weren't heroic returns. They were evacuations from home, into limbo. Because when they landed in Haifa, or Marseille, or Montreal, they didn't find welcome. They found categories, misunderstandings, alienation. They were Jews, but not Ashkenazi, not European, not quite Israeli either. They were spoken to in broken modern Hebrew, given jobs that didn't match their skills, slotted into housing projects far from the centers of power. Their 2,000-year-old traditions were often seen as folklore, not identity. It wasn't just exile. It was dislocation from within. And this fracture wasn't theoretical. It left fingerprints in the genome. The Moroccan Jewish gene pool, once isolated and preserved, was now scattered across 3 continents. But identity isn't just about where you go. It's about how you're seen when you get there. And for Moroccan Jews, The next question cut deeper than migration, deeper than DNA. If you survived exile after exile, but still feel like a stranger, then who exactly are you surviving for? That question didn't just haunt their poetry. It haunted their genome. Because when Moroccan Jews arrived in Israel, scientists finally began to map their DNA, to place them somewhere. But the results refused to cooperate. They didn't cluster with Moroccans, not with Amazigh, not with Arab Muslims, not even with other North African Jews. Instead, the principal component analysis placed them on a strange axis, floating between continents, not quite east, not quite west. Genetically, they sat between Levantine and Southern European populations. Their DNA aligned more closely with Druze, Cypriots, Ashkenazim, and Sephardim from the Balkans than with their own geographic neighbors in the Maghreb. The conclusion? They were not North African Jews, in the way many assumed. They were something older, something layered. Their Y-DNA J1, J2, and traces of Q, YP1236, anchored them in the Near East. Their mtDNA, particularly haplogroups like HV0 and K, reflected the Sephardic infusion post, 1492. But what was missing was equally telling. They lacked the M1 and U6 lineages, the mitochondrial flags of Berber and Arab ancestry. Which means, even after 2 millennia in Morocco, they were still, genetically, not of Morocco. Culturally, it got even more complicated. In Israel, they were labeled Mizrahim, Easterners, grouped with Iraqi, Yemeni, Iranian Jews. But their traditions weren't the same. Their language wasn't the same. Their trauma wasn't the same. And neither was their DNA. They weren't Oriental, but weren't European either. Not in blood, not in status. They were, like a mosaic tile that doesn't fit the floor. Beautiful, intricate, but forever misplaced. And it hurts. In post-1948 Israel, Ashkenazi norms dominated government, schools, academia. Moroccan Jews were often seen as uneducated, backward, primitive. Despite having preserved the oldest genetic core, they were made to feel like newcomers to their own ancestral story. But could the genome do what politics refused? Could science, finally, place them where memory never could? Because buried deep in their DNA was a code older than exile, and it was about to be unlocked. And when geneticists finally broke that code, the shock wasn't in what had changed. It was in what had endured. In 2010, studies by Behar, Atzman, and Ostra cross-examined Jewish genomes across the world, from Morocco, Iran, and Iraq to Lithuania, Greece, and Yemen. More than 1,000 individuals were sequenced. The results were supposed to show divergence, fragmentation, diaspora chaos. Instead, they found convergence. Nearly all Jewish groups, despite millennia of exile, retained a shared ancestral component. Ancient Levantine DNA, rooted in the southern Levant from the Bronze Age, is almost equal to 3,000,200 BC. Moroccan Jews, same Y-DNA haplogroups, J1C3, now JM267, and J2A-JM410, pointing directly to Canaanite and Israelite male ancestry. Their mtDNA told a complementary story. Lineages like K1A1B1A, HV0, T2E, and U5B matched those found in Sephardim from the Balkans, Mizrahim from Mesopotamia, and Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe, proving maternal continuity even across cultural divides. But the truly revolutionary piece came from principal component analysis, PCA, a statistical clustering model. It showed that Moroccan Jews do not align with Moroccan Arabs, nor with Berbers, despite 2,000 years of geographic overlap. Instead, they cluster tightly with Druze, Cypriots, Samaritans, and even Ashkenazi Jews, suggesting a shared origin in the Levantine corridor. As Ostra summarized in his 2012 publication Legacy, A Genetic History of the Jewish People, Jewish groups today are more closely related to each other than to their non-Jewish neighbors, even after 100 generations of exile. This wasn't a metaphor. This was biology as memory. The Torah said the tribes would be scattered, but not lost. And now, with genome-wide sequencing, it's clear. The Jewish story is not just preserved in text, or ritual, or ruins. It's encrypted in the blood, But even the genome has blind spots, because hidden inside some of these samples, from otherwise Levantine Jewish lineages, was a Y chromosome that didn't follow the script. It didn't point to Jerusalem, Babylon, or Spain. It pointed north, to a forgotten migration, to a population that doesn't even appear in Jewish history books. And the closer we look, the deeper the mystery grows. Because just when the genome seemed to confirm the myth, when everything pointed cleanly back to the Levant, a silent anomaly emerged. A shadow in the data. Autosomal DNA from multiple Moroccan Jewish samples revealed something no one expected. A small, consistent signal. 3 to 5% Sub-Saharan African ancestry. Not recent, not colonial, but deep, ancient, estimated to date back 72 generations, or roughly 2,000 years ago, according to Behar et al., 2008, and Campbell et al., 2012. It wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It was real. The timeline aligns with the Roman era, when trans-Saharan trade routes were already pulsing beneath North Africa. Jewish merchants, some freed from slavery, others part of pre-Islamic caravan networks, moved goods from Timbuktu to Tripoli and beyond. Gold, salt, books, and sometimes people. So where did this ancestry come from? One theory points to female-mediated admixture, where Sub-Saharan maternal lineages were absorbed into isolated Jewish communities, possibly through servitude, possibly through conversion, possibly through stories never recorded, voices never heard. Another possibility? The Lemba paradox, a Jewish identifying population in southern Africa whose oral traditions trace back to ancient Jewish traders, and whose Y-DNA carries Semitic signals. Could their story mirror the Moroccan thread in reverse? Could exile have moved both directions, north and south? Either way, it ruptures the idea of purity, because even in communities famed for their isolation, endogamous, ritual-bound, tribe within a tribe, history finds a way in. Through a caravan, through a market, through a mother whose name was never written down, but whose legacy lives in blood. And science tells us what culture often forgets. Exile isn't sterile. It leaves fingerprints. On language. On food, on the genome itself. So if exile leaves this deeper mark on the body, then what does it do to the soul? Sometimes it erases the sound. In 1950, there were nearly 250,000 Jews living in Morocco, a community older than Islam itself. But by 2020, that number had collapsed to just 2,250. 2,250 souls. In a country of over 36 million. Not lost to massacre. Not consumed by war, but by forgetting. The streets of Fez, Meknes, and Essaouira, once lined with kosher butchers, scribes, and tailors, now echo in Arabic only. The ancient Mellahs, Jewish quarters built during the Marinid dynasty in the 15th century, now house Muslim families. Their stone carvings remain. Their mezuzahs are gone. And yet, the fragments remain. In Casablanca, a few synagogues still open their doors. Temple Beth El, with its stained glass and sacred ark, hosts fewer worshippers each year. But the voices still chant the same Sephardic melodies, once sung under the Almohad shadow. In the diaspora, the survival is scattered. The language Akishia, a fusion of medieval Spanish, Hebrew, and Arabic once whispered in Tetuan, now barely survives. It lives only in memory, in the voices of the elderly in Caracas, Buenos Aires, or Ashdod, struggling to pass it on before breath runs out. The songs once sung in Judeo-Arabic now survive as YouTube uploads. The recipes of Shabbat are still cooked, but now with metric measurements. French subtitles, Israeli spices, and the stories, the ones passed through generations by grandmothers over mint tea, now live inside oral archives at Tel Aviv University, or private recordings buried in hard drives. They lit Shabbat candles in Fez. Now, their descendants chant in French, in Hebrew, or in silence. But this isn't just a cultural story, because one final mystery still whispers through the bloodstream, something that doesn't live in memory, or music, or language, a fragment in the genome, a final thread of ancestry that even history forgot to explain. And that thread is still alive, because when the prayers fall silent, when the last synagogue closes its doors, the blood keeps speaking. And what it says is extraordinary. The DNA of Moroccan Jews tells a triple story. One no empire, no border, no textbook has ever fully captured. It begins in the Levant, nearly 3,000 years ago, in the age of Phoenician traders, ancient Israelites, and Bronze Age kingdoms that carved prophecy into stone. Their Y chromosome haplogroups, J1 and J2, clustered with modern-day Druze and Samaritans, confirm deep roots in the cradle of Canaan, a time before Rome, before exile. Then the fracture. In 1492, the Sephardic trauma engraved itself into their maternal lines. Haplogroups like HV0 and K1A1B1A swept in from Iberia, marking forced conversions, pogroms, and mass displacement. The Alhambra Decree didn't just erase Jews from Spain. It injected trauma into their genes, as surely as it burned books from their libraries. Finally, endurance. For over 2,000 years, they stood on North African soil, yet barely touched it genetically. The almost complete absence of Berber marker EM81 is a silent scream, a refusal to dissolve. And yet, a whisper of Sub-Saharan admixture, just 3 to 5%, reminds us that even the most sealed communities breathe in the winds of empire. A genetic triangle, Jerusalem, Toledo, Fez, encoded in blood, not as myth, as map. Because unlike language, culture, or even memory, DNA doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't flinch. It carries exile like a scar, and identity like a vow. From the synagogue ruins of Volubilis, to the Hebrew prayers drifting through Casablanca's Bethel, to the children now learning Ladino lullabies in Montreal, the genome remembers, even when the world no longer does. So, if your ancestors were whispering their story through your blood, would you hear it? Would you trace their footsteps, not across land, but across time? Because the next journey isn't on a map. It's inside you. And somewhere in that double helix, the next untold chapter is already waiting. More lost histories, more blood-borne truths. Subscribe, and we'll uncover the next one together.